you've been brought up in a land where Orthodox Christianity was a majority religion, in the Ukraine and in Russia, and you moved or you left for a different place, the United States. How did you perceive this space at the beginning, and how were you welcome?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't say that it was the majority religion, because remember, I was born in 1972, so this was the time of still the communist night, if you will, over Ukraine, and so the majority of the population are actually atheists. Now, it's true that in my family I had priests going back to several generations, and my mother was very devout, so in that regard, my childhood was such that I saw the devotion of my mother. And the move to the United States, I wouldn't describe as a move from a country that was sort of fearing God to the country that was godless. I think the contrary probably is the case, because statistically, as this might be strange for us to grapple with, but statistically, the church-going population of Ukraine and Russia today is from anywhere from 3% to 10% of the population, depending on the area. The church-going population of the United States is up to 40+% of the regular churchgoers every week. So I wouldn't characterize my move somehow as a move towards a less Christian country. Certainly a country that was differently Christian.
How well and how were you welcomed?
I was actually surprised when I arrived in 1993 at the amount of reception that I received at a Protestant seminary. I was the first Orthodox, the first from the post-Soviet environment, actually, so I was a completely unknown beast, if you will, unknown entity. And the very people that built bunkers so that they could protect themselves and their families from the nuclear threat of the Soviet Union, those very people actually welcomed me with open arms, because they could see beyond the system, and what was important to them was a person rather than some sort of identification with the system. And I think that the amount of warmth and hospitality that I received, a kind of a southern hospitality that I received in Dallas, Texas, was originally very, very inviting. But also it was an environment that was very stimulating intellectually. Because the academy in Texas was a bit like a zoo, meaning that you had Christian theologians from all parts of the United States, and also really a kind of an international Christian community present in the area where the highest expression of culture was Dallas cowboys and stockyards.
How would you say the Orthodox are perceived in the United States, since they are obviously a minority there?
I think the fundamental changes have occurred in the past 50 years. And so Orthodoxy has changed from, the perception of Orthodoxy has changed from it being a completely unknown commodity to a recognizable and significant minority and entity. From people who were dismissed as this sort of oriental oddity, or a bit like Catholics that kiss icons, to an expression of faith, if you will, as spirituality, that is actually extremely attractive to many Western Christians. And so in my own parish, I find that more than 50% actually of the parishioners have come to Orthodoxy via a very, very complex pilgrimage. And so if in the post-Soviet environment it was a pilgrimage usually from no faith to Orthodox faith as a dominant expression of Christianity, in the American environment it was a pilgrimage from deep non-Orthodox faith, Protestant or Catholic, evangelical, Anglican, etc., to an expression of Orthodoxy that to some extent included the richness of those other expressions of Christianity as a part of the package.
You are a graduate of the Institute of Physics and Technology of Moscow, but you also had studies of master's and PhD in patristics at the Southern Methodist University of Dallas, Texas. How would you say physics and theology made peace with each other in your education and career?
I studied in Russia at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union. So this was 1988 to 1992, and the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. And so essentially I began as a student who was a part of this larger empire. And then I finished as quote-unquote a foreigner, because technically I was from Ukraine. So by the time I graduated, I was no longer a domestic student, but became a foreign student. This was an extraordinary time, and I see myself as belonging to the generation of perestroika, effectively, in Russia. It was an extraordinary time in the sense of the openness of society to religion, as of course a similar dynamic happened in Romania at that time. It was a time when it was, if you will, fashionable amongst the youth and amongst the college students to embrace Christianity. Christianity was sort of a cool thing to try out. And I think it was a time of great crisis, economically and otherwise. It was also a time of tremendous historical, taking stock of historical values and tremendous sort of national repentance, if you will, for the problems and sins of communist past. And I think that this past, or this process actually, of repentance has now been forgotten in contemporary Russia, in Putin's Russia. I mean, Putin's Russia has abandoned, in many ways, perestroika as a cultural project, and is now looking back to the time of the empire as something that will redeem its past. And I think that's a wrong path. At that time, I actually audited courses in Orthodox theology and church history, and frankly, theology is all I wanted to study. And at that time, there were the intellectual options that were available to me in the post-Soviet space were very limited. And I knew what the highest expressions of intellectual rigor look like in physics and science. And I simply would not be able to kind of compromise on those standards were I simply to go to an Orthodox seminary. I think I would have been very disappointed if I were to continue down that path within the post-Soviet environment. Now today, there are of course Orthodox universities in Russia and elsewhere in the post-communist space, but then in 1990s, very little was available then. And that was the reason for my crossing the ocean. It was really continuing my theological education, and at that time I already really saw myself as a professor of theology. I really thought that that was probably my vocation.
Would you say that one can find God in any of the fields of research, such as the technical field of research, and how would one find God?
Well, the saints certainly find God everywhere, and be it in nature, be it in the face of other human beings, be it in the situations of utter and complete human hopelessness. And so to some extent, of course, it takes the eyes of grace and the eyes of faith to see God. But I also think that contemporary, especially young generation, needs to be helped in this regard. And we can also foreclose certain venues of inquiry by, for example, saying that natural sciences have absolutely nothing to do with theology, or that natural sciences are to be studied in such a way that the question of God is bracketed, the question of God is not on the table. And to some extent, people who in my own formation made those types of provocative statements that took materialism very dogmatically as a default position functioned as sort of provocators. That's to say, they teased me into thinking something else, into believing something else. And so I think today one of the ways in which we can do it in the university is by thinking through the way in which knowledge could be integrated. By ways in which various knowledge domains could be integrated with religious philosophy and theology, with theology functioning both as something that is the foundation of sciences, because God is the source of everything in nature, with theology functioning as that which unites the sciences, and also that which completes the whole edifice. So you start with the foundation, and you build on that as a premise, but then also there is a sense in which theological questions uniquely the questions that arise in theology could be dealt with by different sciences. So in that regard, theology becomes a forum for all sciences. But then it also completes the whole enterprise because it also gives sciences a sense of direction, a sense of purpose, a kind of a why, ultimate why question is answered in theology and philosophy, whereas the how questions, which are equally significant, are answered in natural sciences.
You are a professor at the Theology Department of the University of St. Thomas. We would like to know if you could tell us how does actually a class develop under your supervision? How are your students caught up in your the way you teach them and what you tell them, and are they perceiving, are they grasping well your
So I teach a fairly broad variety of courses, from very, very introductory courses, which are attended by non-theology students, in which we talk about all kinds of things, from creation to the events of the 20th century. So it's a very broad course. So we do introduction to the Bible, then introduction to the Christian theological tradition. And so, in a sense, the students receive the history of Western civilization through the prism of Christianity, through the things that are significant in Christianity. Very often I work historically, although it's true that in order to gain interest of contemporary students, you of course have to bring in contemporary issues, you have to bring in politics, you have to bring in important moral questions, ethical questions that are relevant to students' lives. And of course, without that, it's very difficult to sell American students on pure history. In fact, it's impossible. And so what that means also is that my courses have engaged literature, engages various genres. I also teach on graduate level. And I also, because my position is presently largely a research post, I also deal a lot with junior faculty and also do small seminars for junior faculty, because we have really phenomenally talented junior faculty at St. Thomas. It's just market situation really defines that. The market for jobs is extremely competitive in the United States, and that determines the fact that we really get the best. And those people really want to write, and they want to think, and therefore I try to do certain things that would stimulate that. And that means essentially finding ways in which we could cooperate, meaning faculty can cooperate in various projects. So we do interdisciplinary seminars. I run a seminar. Next semester I'm going to do a seminar on spiritual perception. And that's a notion, that's a question of how does one come in touch with the divine? How do we experience God when we stand in the liturgy and we claim to have a sense of the presence of God? Well, how does that happen? And so we'll look at the question of spiritual perception, as the spiritual senses, from a variety of perspectives: theological, philosophical, anthropological, cognitive science, even art history. And so, or biblical studies. Is there something, for example, when the New Testament in the Sermon on the Mount makes a claim, blessed are the pure of heart, for they shall see God. What kind of claim is being made? What sorts of eyes does it take, if you will, to see God? It's that sort of question that this seminar is trying to answer, but it's trying to answer by integrating my colleagues. I also work with political science people, I work with lawyers, I work with, actually across the border. I see my post as a kind of a bridge building post within the school, so that we don't have to say why theology matters, we just show how theology connects various disciplines.
You have recently initiated a series of public lectures that you have entitled The New Frontiers in Theological Research, where professors of the University of Minnesota share the results of their academic research with students and the auditory. Is the general public of the US interested in this kind of research and the event as such?
Yes, we advertise them, we try to advertise them vigorously. We start advertising them early on. Of course, we compete with various other events that are happening in my area, which is Minnesota, specifically Twin Cities. But we often get more than 100 people essentially attending those public lectures. And so this is the series in New Frontiers in Theological Research. And the idea is very simple. Once every semester, so 2 public lectures a year, I ask essentially one of my colleagues to give a public lecture on the subject of his or her own research. And so what people do then is something that they have thought about for a very long time, something about which they've published something very technical, very complex. They now need to translate into laymen's terms or laywomen's terms. So they have to translate that into terms that would be accessible to general public. And many of my colleagues find this to be very exciting and at the same time very challenging, actually, because something that's obvious to you now needs to be made obvious to a much broader audience. Now, we hope that with the teaching experience that we have, we sort of know our audience, and we hope that our students would be with us, and if they're not with us, they'll tell us. So what we have is this is a 40-minute lecture, so it's a very short lecture, and then there's a Q&A of also about 40 minutes. And then we celebrate that with a dinner in a kind of an informal exchange. This has worked extremely well. People love talking about their work. And I actually now have plans till 2019, and that's for the next 5 years. I basically have my colleagues signed up for this undertaking. And of course, I'm very grateful to my colleagues for a very strong show of support of this series. To give you a sense of what that series is about, so very recently we had lectures on theology and science, and particularly, say, the issue of Big Bang and what it has to do with evolution and creation. We had a lecture on the Muslim-Christian dialogue, because we have a center of Muslim-Christian dialogue at the University of St. Thomas. And we've also had a lecture on the how children were treated in the Greco-Roman society, and whether early Christianity made any difference to the lives of children. A fascinating lecture. So these are the types of things, these are the types of lectures that become the stuff of this series.
In your works, you study both Russian and Greek Orthodox thought. Are there similarities between the two theological cultures? How about differences?
Now, of course, we're talking about the 20th century, so we're talking about essentially largely modern Orthodox theology. And so, more concretely, in my book on a 20th century Russian Orthodox theologian, who incidentally was brought up in Odessa, which after all is not quite Russia, but Ukraine, and who was actually half Ukrainian and half Russian, George Florovsky. His dates are 1893 to 1979, so he died roughly speaking 35 years ago. But Florovsky has actually influenced a whole generation of Greek theologians. For example, John Romanidis and John Zizioulas were both his students at Harvard, at Divinity School. And both of them, and especially Zizioulas, have taken the work of Florovsky in some very creative directions. Romanidis, I think, was much more insular and much more dismissive of the project of Western theology than Florovsky himself was. I can also say that Yanaras, modern Greek theologian Christos Yanaras, has also actually been profoundly influenced by Florovsky's historical narrative of the ways of modern Orthodox theology. So there are these interesting cross-pollinations. There was a lot of conversation between the diaspora, Russian-speaking theologians of 1930s and the Greeks. And then in the 1950s and 60s, again, that exchange was very intense. And of course, after the fall of the Iron Curtain, simply Russian seminarians or Russian-speaking seminarians from all over the post-Soviet Union came to Greece to study. I mean, I assume that some of them also came to Romania to study, but it's certainly the case that they came to Thessaloniki and to Athens to study.
In one of the books that the Doxologia publishing house published is devoted to the passion of the, say, unpassionable.
It's the title of the book is The Suffering of the Impassible God. And then the subtitle is The Dialectics of Patristic Thought.
So we'd like to know a little bit more about the central idea behind the book.
Well, first of all, I'm grateful to Doxologia Publishing House for making these books available in Romanian. It's very valuable to me that now the book has a very large and educated and sophisticated and important audience. It's a great opportunity for me to meet my audience because I think that the books really come alive precisely when they're received, when there is a discussion of them. So the central question of the book is this. Given the reality of human brokenness and human suffering, and given the reality of human death, well, what does God have anything to do with it? And if we were to sharpen that question, we could ask the following question. Christ suffered on the cross. Does this mean that God suffered? And my essentially answer to that question was driven by what the church fathers, the early church theologians, have thought about the question. Now, contemporary theology very often presents the thought of the fathers as if all you had in the early church was the position that no, God is beyond suffering. He couldn't possibly suffer. The only thing that suffered was Jesus' human nature, but God himself checked out of the equation. Whereas contemporary theology presents itself as saying, well, surely God suffered because the very meaning of divine love and compassion is precisely manifest in the suffering of God. So we have to abandon any kind of notion that God transcends suffering. Well, the argument of the book tries to zero in on the paradox of how God, who transcends suffering, can nevertheless enter the tragedy of human suffering in Christ's human nature and transform it. So the point of the book was to say that if we can speak of God as participating in suffering, that suffering has to be free. And so the church has emphasized this idea of free and voluntary passion of Christ. And it has to be transformative, and its purpose has to be salvation of the world. And so in the book, I explicitly deny the notion that God suffers perpetually or that God suffers eternally. So I believe that that notion is deeply problematic. But I do affirm the idea that there is a victory over suffering and death in the reality of God. And so that there is so the Paschal mystery, if you will, is fulfilled both through the cross and through the resurrection, by ultimately affirming that there is a redemption and victory, conquest of suffering and death in the life of God. That is the fundamental thesis.
Until recently, when the two books of yours were published by the publishing house here in Iași, what did you know about Romania, about the Romanian Orthodox theology? Perhaps there was a Romanian Orthodox theologian that you cared for or appreciated, or of whose works maybe you recommended to your students?
Well, yes. Well, I visited Romania a couple of years ago. Specifically, I visited Cluj, and then subsequently we went to the beautiful painted monasteries of the Bukovina region. So that was a memorable, truly memorable time and trip. In Cluj, what very pleasantly surprised me was this coexistence of several theological faculties of Romanian Orthodox or Eastern Orthodox, and then Greek Catholics, Roman Catholics, and Reformed. So that I thought was an interesting experiment, not necessarily ecumenical, but certainly a dialogue of different confessional forms of Christianity. I was also struck by again, the fact that we were received in a university environment and the sort of the level of the discussion was I thought that was quite high. And then we also had some very, very precious conversations as we traveled through Bukovina region that is just delightful and beautiful. And the hospitality in the monasteries was also quite memorable. And also the very fact that kind of a monastery serves as this natural center in those areas that, the kids, school kids, for example, as they begins the school day, they would come to the monastery, venerate the icons, and then on the way back home, they would come and get their lunch at a local female monastery or nunnery. In terms of theologians, in terms of the Romanian theologians, I must confess that my knowledge is primarily restricted to Father Dumitru Staniloae. And so his heritage has recently, in the past 20 years, been a subject of a number of important monographs in English. And so also he's been translated in English, and of course that's what makes him more accessible. And so his understanding of the relationship between negative, so-called negative theology and positive theology, or apophatic and cataphatic theology, and his Christology sort of premised on the synthesis that was developed by Maximus the Confessor are perhaps two areas that I have looked at more carefully. But I also, of course, realize how significant his ecclesiology is and how significant is his account of religious experience and the function of the church in that is. And I suspect that there are some interesting inspirations of Florovsky having to do with that side of his theology. But this is just something that remains to be developed.
Well, the Holy Synod of the Romanian Orthodox Church has declared 2015 to be the year of the mission of the parish and the monastery today, and a commemorative year of the John Chrysostom's and great, shepherds of the eparchies. So, from your point of view, which is the role of the parish today in the society of today, and which is the role of the monastery?
Well, I certainly hope that the spiritual resources of the monastery have not been exhausted. I mean, John Chrysostom is very dear to my heart. Actually, my first book that I wrote while I was still a graduate student was on how one became a Christian in the early church. The title was The History of the Catechumenate in the Early Church, and that was originally published in Russian, and then an authorized translation was published by a group of Belgian translators in French. So there is a chapter there on the Antiochian tradition, and particularly on Chrysostom, but also even on Theodore of Mopsuestia as an evangelist or as a catechist, as a missionary, as a Christian, essentially, teacher. So the teaching role of the church is something that I've spent much time on, both as a historian, but also something I do professionally within my parish, in a sense of being a catechist. So when I return, for example, I serve as a godfather to a person who will be baptized in a week from now. And I also do a kind of an adult study before liturgy. So I think the role of the parish is immense, because I think that the work that needs to be done is very often one-on-one work. And it's really development through the network of connections, through friends, etc., is how very often the gospel is spread. So I think that the role of the parish is going to be primary, going to remain primary. I mean, that said, the monastery has a unique focus in the Orthodox tradition, and for me personally, for my own development, the spirituality of Philokalia, and particularly Jesus' prayer, has been quite important. Years after teaching Philokalia, I realized that it's a text that needs to be handled with great care, and that requires a lot of translation into the realities of the contemporary church and into the realities of contemporary life. So I think the principal issue for us today is not to look askance or to look, not to turn our back on the people of today, this generation and this culture, and to find a language that would be both true to the Orthodox tradition and the Orthodox faith, and also would speak, would touch the hearts of modern Christians. As an educator, I suppose ultimately that's really my primary goal, and everything else is really secondary.
Were there priests, either lay priests or hiero monks maybe, or starets, who had an influence over you? And if you could tell us in what way?
Well, in my college years, there was actually a man who became a priest in the Orthodox Church. His name was Father George Chistiakov, and he was associated with the a group that was related to Father Alexander Meny. And so Alexander Meny was an evangelist, an apologist, a public intellectual, a figure who at the time of this sort of Soviet night, where there was a kind of a desert of the spirit, and that there were really no people who could speak about the gospel, had the courage, intellectual courage, to nourish people and meet their spiritual thirst, both as a parish priest, but also as somebody who worked as a missionary, really as a missionary priest. And so in my own college, Father George Chistyakov, who was the disciple of Father Alexander Meny, at that point read a set of lectures entitled Christianity, History and Culture. But it wasn't really about history, it wasn't about culture, it was an interpretation of the New Testament, it was an introduction to the Orthodox faith done with tremendous amount of conviction and clarity and eloquence and beauty. And it was a man who ultimately, in whom I was interested because he truly mediated God. I mean, we first thought, as a physicist, I first thought he was a Martian because he spoke the language of philologists and people in humanities and in general, people not to be taken terribly seriously. But as I listened more to him and as I listened more to what God has to say, to tell through him, it was very clear to me also that this man had something that was not purely human to offer. So that experience, the experience of following this teacher to the to a kind of an electric to the train station, actually, which happened to be about a mile away, about a couple of kilometers away from my college. That road to Emmaus was deeply formative for me, and that formation is really also something that underlies what I do as an educator. In other words, I had that fundamental experience of a deeper conversion as a college student, and that's why I believe that it could also happen with the college students of today. I actually have nothing but great hope in this generation, and I think this generation in Ukraine especially has shown itself to be capable of courage, of sacrificial love, of, well, fighting obviously for the integrity, the sovereignty of the country, and also trying to build the future, and a very different future, and kind of moving out of the corruption and devastation left by by the communist times.
Professor, thank you very much for accepting to offer this interview for the Doxologia portal, and you are always welcome to us in Iași.
Thank you so much for your wonderful hospitality.